Either they don't know, don't show, or don't care about what's going on in the hood.
Welcome to our ultimate breakdown of two of the greatest hood dramas of all time, Boyz N the Hood versus Menace II Society. We're ranking the top 100 black movies of all time, and this head-to-head battle is too close to call. Doughboy versus O-Dog, who was the realist. Which one was the true definition of the streets? Ice Cube's Doughboy was a product of his environment, understanding the inevitable fate that came with it. But Larenz Tate's O-Dog, pure chaos, a walking time bomb, the wild card that made every scene unpredictable. Who was more dangerous? More tragic? More legendary? Trey versus Caine, the diverging paths of the hood. Both had father figures guiding them. Furious styles preaching wisdom, while Caine had OGs like Pernell trying to keep him out of trouble. But their choices shaped their fates. Could Trey have ended up like Caine if he stayed? Could Caine have escaped like Trey if he had a Furious in his life? Are these movies in the same universe? Think about it. Boyz N the Hood dropped in 91, Menace in 93. The stories take place in South Central LA, roughly a few years apart. Could Doughboy's death off-screen have been the event that shifted the streets, leading to an even colder, more ruthless era scene in Menace? Was O-Dog inspired by Doughboy's legacy? Is Menace II Society actually the sequel to Boyz N the Hood without ever being confirmed? We're diving deep into the themes, settings, characters, and cultural impact of these two undeniable classics. Which one truly defined the streets? Which one had the better story, the realest message, and the most unforgettable performances? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Which movie ranks higher on our top 100 list? Two certified street legends. Two completely different energies. Doughboy versus O-Dog. One was a product of his environment. The other was the most reckless force the hood had ever seen. But the real question, who was the truest definition of the streets? Who was more dangerous? More tragic? More legendary? Let's break it all down. Number one, the mindset, street smarts versus pure chaos. Right off the bat, we gotta talk about their mentalities, because this is where we see the biggest difference. Doughboy, he wasn't just some reckless killer. He understood the game. He knew how the world saw him. He knew what his fate was, and deep down, he was at peace with it. He saw the cycle, but he also knew there was no escaping it. His actions weren't random. He played the game because he had no other choice. O-Dog? That boy was different. Pure, unfiltered chaos. The moment he shot that Korean store owner, we knew exactly who he was. A time bomb, with zero fear of consequences. Doughboy reacted to the world around him. O-Dog? He made the world react to him. Number two, who was more dangerous? Now, let's be real. Both of these dudes were dangerous in their own way. Doughboy? You could tell he was raised in it. He knew the rules of the streets. When Ricky got killed, he moved with purpose. He didn't act out of ego or for fun. He handled business because that's how it goes. But O-Dog, man, he was dangerous for a whole different reason. Because he had no rules. Doughboy had a moral code. He never did anything unnecessarily. But O-Dog, it didn't matter if you were a stranger, an enemy, or someone who just looked at him wrong. He was ready to take you out with a smile. So ask yourself what's scarier. A dude who's street smart and strategic, or a dude who'll shoot you just for looking at him the wrong way? Number three, who had the more tragic story? Now let's talk tragedy. Because as tough as these two were, both of them were victims of their environment. Doughboy, man, his whole life was a setup for failure. His mom hated him. He was in and out of juvie, and the one person he truly loved, his brother Ricky, got taken away from him. And what's worse, he knew the streets weren't gonna let him live either. That final scene, where he just fades into the background, that was his silent goodbye. The hood had already made its decision. O-Dog, his ending was just as tragic, but for a different reason, because he never had a chance to change. He was already too far gone. He was only 16. 16, and he was already a full-blown killer with bodies on his name. That final scene getting locked up, that was his destiny from the start. One was taken by the streets. The other was claimed by the system. Either way, they both lost. Number 4. Who was more legendary? Now this is where the debate gets real. Who left a bigger impact? Who was the most legendary? Doughboy? He was the heart and soul of Boyz N the Hood. He had the best lines, the realest outlook, and his story was the most emotional. Ice Cube brought the perfect mix of pain, power, and wisdom. O-Dog? Man, Larenz Tate straight up stole every scene he was in. He wasn't just a character, he was an energy. When you think of Menace II Society, you think of O-Dog first. He became the blueprint for the young, reckless street dude in every hood movie after him. So let's call it. Doughboy was the realest, but O-Dog was the scariest. Number 5, final verdict. Who was the realest? So who takes the crown? Who was the truest of the streets? If we're talking about who had the most knowledge of the game, Doughboy. If we're talking about who was the most unpredictable and feared, O-Dog. If we're talking about who had the more tragic story, it's a tie, because both were doomed from the start. But at the end of the day, Doughboy was the realest. He wasn't just reckless. He understood the world around him. O-Dog, he was a force of nature, a monster created by the streets. But Doughboy, he was a survivor until the streets finally caught up to him. But what do y'all think? Was O-Dog the realest because he had no fear? Was Doughboy the realist because he had wisdom? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's debate. 2 young black men, 2 dangerous environments, 2 completely different fates. Today, we're breaking down one of the biggest what-ifs in hood cinema. Trey versus Caine, the diverging paths of the hood. Could Trey have ended up like Caine? Could Caine have escaped if he had a furious Styles in his life? Let's get into it. Number 1, the father figures, wisdom versus warnings. First off, let's talk about the most important difference, the guidance they had. Trey had furious Styles, a disciplined, educated black man who saw the bigger picture. Furious wasn't just a father, he was a blueprint. He instilled responsibility, knowledge of self, and most importantly, the ability to see beyond the hood before it was too late. Caine? He had OGs like Pernell, but the game had already swallowed them whole. Pernell tried to keep him out of trouble, but let's be real. How much wisdom can you give from behind bars? And then you got Caine's grandfather, a preacher who wasn't street savvy enough to keep him safe. Furious was in the trenches present and actively shaping Trey's future. Big difference. Number 2, the environments, a fine line between survival and escape. Next, let's talk about environment. South Central was a war zone in both movies. But the key difference? Trey had options. His dad made sure he saw another way. He had a college-bound girlfriend, a future to look forward to, and a path out. Caine? Man, he was deep in it. The streets weren't just an influence, they were his whole world. Even though he knew right from wrong, the lifestyle had him trapped. He had money, respect, and reputation, but at what cost? The violence was normalized. He didn't see himself living past 25, and that mentality, it's deadly. Number 3, could Trey have ended up like Caine? Now here's the real question. Could Trey have ended up like Caine? The answer? Absolutely. Trey wasn't perfect. He had anger. He had the temptation to retaliate. We saw it when he rode out with Doughboy. But he was smart enough to get out the car. Why? Because he had Furious in his head, the voice of reason. But if Furious wasn't there, if he was raised by the streets instead, that same Trey could have easily been Caine, caught up in the same cycle, trapped with no way out. Number 4, could Caine have escaped like Trey? Now let's flip it. Could Caine have escaped like Trey? Again, absolutely, but only if he had a Furious Styles guiding him. Caine wasn't a lost cause. He was smart, observant, and had a conscience. He wanted out. He tried to change. But by the time he realized it was too late, the streets already had their grip on him. Number 5, the lesson, 2 fates, 1 choice. The difference between Trey and Caine wasn't just luck. It was guidance. It was influence. It was choices. Trey had someone to pull him back before it was too late. Caine? He realized his fate 1 step too late. At the end of the day, these 2 characters show us a chilling reality. one decision. One moment. One mentor. That's all it takes to change everything. So what do y'all think? Could Trey become Caine? Could Caine have made out like Trey? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's talk about it. Yo, what if I told you that Boyz N the Hood and Menace II Society are actually connected? Not just similar, but part of the same timeline? Think about it. Boyz N the Hood dropped in 91. Menace II Society hit in 93. Both take place in South Central LA. Both show the harsh realities of the hood. And most importantly, both show how the streets evolved and got even worse. But here's where it gets crazy. What if Doughboy's off-screen death was the event that changed the entire hood? What if his murder led to an era so ruthless it created O-Dog? Y'all ain't ready for this one. Let's break it all down. Number 1, the timeline. When do these stories take place? Alright, let's start with the timeline. In Boyz N the Hood, the main events go down in 1991. Doughboy, Ricky, and Trey are 17 years old at that point. In Menace II Society, Caine is also 17 years old, but this movie takes place around 1993. That means Menace II Society happens asterisk just a couple of years after Boyz. Not a different era, not a different time, just the next chapter. But here's where it gets deep. What if Doughboy's death was a turning point that made the streets even more ruthless? Number 2, Doughboy's death changed the streets. We never see Doughboy die in Boyz N the Hood, but we know it happens. The moment Trey walks away, the screen tells us Doughboy was murdered just 2 weeks later. Now here's what we gotta ask. Who killed Doughboy? Was it revenge for Ferris? Was it cops cleaning up the streets? Or was it someone trying to take his place? And if Doughboy, one of the most respected dudes in Crenshaw, got taken out, what does that do to the hood? It creates a power vacuum. The new generation, they ain't moving like Doughboy. They're moving like O-Dog. No morals, no rules, just violence with no purpose. Number 3, was O-Dog inspired by Doughboy? Now let's talk about O-Dog, the most ruthless dude in Menace. We know O-Dog is only 16 in the movie. That means he was around 14 years old when Doughboy was on the scene. So let's ask the question, did O-Dog look up to Doughboy? Think about it. O-Dog and Doughboy both carried themselves with that same I don't care energy. But the difference? Doughboy had a code. O-Dog? He was reckless. So what if O-Dog saw Doughboy as a legend, but instead of learning from his mistakes, he took the worst parts of him and turned it into something even deadlier? O-Dog didn't care about respect. He didn't care about loyalty. He just wanted to prove he was the hardest dude in the streets. And the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. O-Dog is what happens when the old heads like Doughboy disappear, and there's nobody left to keep the next generation in check. Number 4, the evolution of the hood, from Boyz to Menace. If Boyz N the Hood was about trying to escape the cycle, Menace II Society was about being consumed by it. Let's break it down. In Boyz N the Hood, Trey had Furious Styles, a father figure who taught him how to move. In Menace II Society, Caine had Pernell, but he was locked up. The knowledge wasn't there anymore. In Boyz N the Hood, Doughboy still had a sense of loyalty and respect. In Menace II Society, O-Dog had none of that. He was a straight-up menace. So what happened? The hood got worse. The OGs got locked up, murdered, or faded away. And what's left? Pure chaos. By the time Menace happens, there's no more Treys trying to leave. There's no more Furious Styles teaching game. All that's left are the O-Dogs of the world. Number 5. So, is Menace II Society the sequel to Boyz N the Hood? So after all this, we gotta ask the big question. Is Menace II Society the unofficial sequel to Boyz N the Hood? The timeline lines up. The streets got worse after Doughboy's death. O-Dog feels like the natural evolution of Doughboy's influence, without any structure. So even if John Singleton and the Hughes brothers never confirmed it, we gotta admit, Menace II Society feels like the next chapter of Boyz N the Hood. The first movie showed us the struggle to escape. The second one showed us what happens when escape is no longer an option. It's like seeing the hood before and after hope is gone. But what do y'all think? Is this the same universe? Is O-Dog the next generation after Doughboy? Did Doughboy's death change the streets forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it.